it's my pleasure to have the chance to welcome everyone to Core Volunteer Training tonight. The topic is a deep dive with Carbon Fee and Dividend. And let's just do a quick introduction about what to expect for tonight's lesson. So first off, here are our 3 learning goals. After tonight's lesson, hopefully everyone should be able to understand the rationale behind the 3 legs of CCL's flagship policy. Really describe each of these legs in your own words, or at least start feeling more comfortable with that, as well as how it would function within our country. We also hope that all attendees will feel comfortable in addressing economic issues that are related to each of these legs that are often raised by others with questions that you might encounter. And Robert has set up his slide deck to really address a lot of these commonly asked questions to help field those for you, as well as those that might ask you later on. The agenda is pretty straightforward. After this introduction, we're going to have basically all 3 of those legs of the policy described in detail one at a time. The fee first with common questions, followed by the dividend, and then the border adjustment. And then lastly, we'll have a robust Q&A discussion and get to any questions that any of you on the line have tonight. So before passing it over to Robert, I'd just love to introduce our presenter tonight. His name is Robert Archer. He's an economist by training with degrees from both Yale and the University of Pittsburgh. Former Peace Corps volunteer and worked on energy reform, regulatory development, and energy efficiency in Eastern Europe, the former Soviet Union, South and Southeast Asia, within USAID, the Agency for International Development. And he now spends his time generously volunteering for CCL and serves on the steering committee of the Marin, California CCL chapter, as well as being part of the CCL Economic Policy Network. So we're honored to have you. Thank you so much for being here, Robert, and I'll pass the baton to you.
Thank you, Brett, and hello and welcome to all. I want to start with a slide to give some context as we discuss the CCL proposal. It's useful to consider the framework people have when they consider a carbon tax. A synthesis of 39 studies was done by 2 Swiss and English research institutes to identify how to make carbon taxes more acceptable. It showed 4 main concerns. Personal costs are too high was the first. The second is a negative impact on low-income households. The third is a mistrust that people have about governments. They want the revenues and not emission reductions. And the fourth is that a carbon tax is not effective in discouraging high carbon behavior. The beauty of our policy is that the first 3 are addressed directly by how the carbon fee and dividend are designed. The last big obstacle, number 4, is a perception that this presentation tonight hopes to address head-on throughout our webinar. The misunderstanding that a carbon tax is not effective in discouraging high carbon behavior. The same study indicated that mistrust in government leads to a desire to designate or earmark the carbon fee revenues. The first preference is for clean energy expenditures, and the second is a household dividend. The good news is that these 2 preferences can be reversed so that the household dividend becomes the priority. How is that? Make it clear that the carbon fee does reduce emissions. People then realize the funds don't all have to go to clean energy subsidies and programs. Now, why a fee? To raise the cost. Raise the price of fossil fuels and demand goes down and emissions go down. This connection is not sufficiently understood or accepted. Note the major difference. Current regulatory policies aim to reduce clean energy costs. The carbon fee aims to increase fossil energy costs. The second main reason is to correct a market failure. When a factory dumps its pollution in the air and water, the cost falls on us, not them. It's a negative external cost in economic parlance. When someone burns fossil fuels, the CO2 and its cost are dumped on everybody else, not those who burn. It's not a cost of doing business for them. There's no incentive to change. To change incentives, a Pigouvian tax is placed on the pollution. Economist Arthur Perdue formulated this concept in 1920. It internalizes the cost back onto the polluter. CCL's carbon fee puts the cost back on the cause of the pollution, fossil fuels. Any carbon fee won't do. The great power of CCL's escalating fee is the predictable rising price. It sends a powerful signal and incentive for large-scale clean energy investment and unleashing innovation. No other broad-based climate policy is able to provide this. The chart on the right, which may be a little hard to read, shows 11 countries' carbon taxes. Most are well above $15 a ton. And 12 countries' cap and trade programs on the right, mostly below $15 a ton. There are many other reasons as well to support a fee. I bring your attention to the last one. Fee and dividend is the best fit for developing countries with weak institutions and corruption compared to opaque and complex cap and trade. Whenever we talk about placing a fee on carbon to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, the question eventually comes up, isn't a fee the same as a tax? Fee is an appropriate term. It's commonly used for environmental programs that assign cost to pollution activities. For example, people that dump their garbage in the street, there's a fee for pickup. It was often imposed. But maybe the best reason came from George Shultz, who was Ronald Reagan's Secretary of State and also served as Treasury Secretary. Shultz, who's a CCL Advisory Board member, has told CCL, it's not a tax if the government doesn't keep the money. And that's the point. If all the revenue is given to all households as direct payments, as Shultz recommends, then they're not being taxed. The fee is not a fundraiser for more government programs. It uses as a signal, a price signal, to shape the billions of investment and consumption decisions toward more clean energy and greater efficiency. The fee starts at $15 a ton and rises $10 each year to $205 a ton. It continues on in order to achieve 90% reductions by 2050. A fee of $25 a ton or $50 a ton could generate from $1.25 trillion to over $2.5 trillion over a decade. We're talking very large sums of money. CCL's proposal starts low and steadily escalates, unlike several other proposals. It avoids economic shock and the potential early political backlash and allows economic adjustment by industry, utilities, and households. And it provides a clear long-term signal to get the largest behavior response. Carbon fee and dividend will use existing IRS and Treasury Department procedures and avoid creating new bureaucracies. Where is it applied? Upstream, that is, as close as possible to the mine, well, and point of importation. For coal, the fee could be imposed at the mine or coal prep plant. That's about 500 plants. You could use, for example, the IRS excise tax form 720. For oil, it could be imposed at the refinery. That's about 140 refineries. And natural gas at the processing plant. That's about 500 plants. For non-fossil emissions like hydrofluorocarbons, etc., CCL's proposal states, the Department of Energy shall propose and promulgate regulations setting forth CO2 equivalent fees for other greenhouse gases. Now, there are at least two significant misunderstandings about the fee and dividend that continue to emerge. The first is that many hold the view that industries will pass on all the carbon fee to consumers. This misunderstanding sometimes comes from the critics of carbon fee policy. The impression given is that polluters can continue business as usual with a carbon fee. In fact, the carbon fee affects all industry, businesses, governments, utilities, and consumers, all investment and consumption decisions are affected. Most industries have to absorb some of the rising input costs and also pass on some of them as well. The second myth holds that the fee does not reduce emissions. Therefore, many conclude the revenues must be spent on clean energy subsidies and programs to make that happen. Rising energy costs affect all sectors' investment and consumption decisions. The price signals nudge all toward greater efficiency in a search for cheaper, cleaner alternatives. In economics, it's known as the substitution effect. The result is declining emissions at the other end of the economy, driven by the rising cost of fossil fuel inputs. People who don't connect rising fossil fuel costs with emission reductions tend to favor spending revenues on clean energy subsidies and programs. Those who understand the connection are more inclined to support revenue neutrality and the dividend. Now, what about the dividend? Let's move to the second leg of the CCL's policy, the dividend, or the household dividend, or carbon dividend, as it's sometimes called. Why a household dividend? It's equitable and protects low and middle income households. People will like it and lobby for a continued fee and dividend, and it pumps money into the economy at the consumer level. The household dividend consists of a full share for up to 2 adults, half shares for up to 2 children up to age 18. Revenue is very large, around 80 billion in year 1, 130 in year 2, and 1.5 trillion over 10 years. Why the household versus individual payment? Households are recipients for reasons of administrative efficiency. Given that there are 150 million plus household tax returns each year, making payments individuals would increase the number and complexity. The monthly check maintains awareness and builds a constituency for sustaining the carbon fee and dividend, similar to the Alaska Permanent Fund, which provides annual dividends to their citizens. How is it administered? Here's a quick look at a potential IRS process. In tax season, taxpayers file, and non-taxpayers would file a special form to get in the database. Second step, the dividend payment amount would be determined for each recipient. Monthly payments would be made from the Carbon Trust Fund. And third, reconciliation of over and under payments would be made in the following tax season. The cost has been estimated based on CCL's study of about $6 billion for the first year of implementation, which comes out to about 2% of revenues as the program becomes routine over the years. The politics of dividends and the whole revenue neutrality issue can be complex. Long-term sustainability of any climate policy is critical. The dividend creates a long-term broad-based constituency for maintaining the carbon fee and dividend policy. The Alaska Permanent Fund that I mentioned is 43 years old, shows the staying power of the dividend concept. Citizens have fought to keep their annual dividend in place. Many conservatives and progressives have different interests for the revenues, that is, tax swaps or spending on clean energy. The economic impact of the fee and dividend. True to our core value of integrity, CCL keeps up on the many studies out there to ask, what kind of economic impacts can we expect from the fee and dividend? The economic impact is about break-even, slightly positive, slightly negative, depending upon modeling and assumptions. For certain, it's not an economic catastrophe. The REMI study shows results on employment, gross national product, and income that are slightly positive over 20 years. The study includes health benefits also. The segments of the U.S. economy that will benefit are generally the U.S. service industries, that is, retail, healthcare, etc. Many economic impact studies have been done in the past decade, while some, like REMI, have shown a positive economic impact, and others have found a slight negative economic impact. The emerging consensus is that while tax swaps may benefit overall economic growth slightly more than revenues being given back to households, overall difference in a carbon fee's economic impact is quite small. However, the tax swap policy will be much less equitable, and CCL prioritizes equity concerns for low and middle income households. Now, the dividend is the most equitable use of revenues. The bottom 70% of households generally break even or come out ahead. Their dividend equals or exceeds the increased cost of energy and products. And this is an Office of Tax Analysis, Treasury Department study. The dividend is progressive. It disproportionately benefits lower income households. The other options of revenue recycling, corporate taxes, payroll tax cuts, personal tax cuts, all do less to benefit the lower deciles. The CCL study shows 53% of U.S. households are net beneficiaries. This is a bit conservative because the model is static and doesn't reflect known consumer and producer behavior in response to the price changes. So let's examine the alternative uses of the revenues and their equity impacts. First, the tax swaps, and then the clean energy spending. Instead of a dividend, the fee on fossil energy could be offset by tax cuts or swaps. Economists generally emphasize efficiency and favor raising taxes on bad things, fossil energy and cigarettes, and lowering them on good productive things, that is, capital and labor. This makes the economy more efficient, but less equitable in our situation. Instead of a dividend, some advocate spending revenues on clean energy subsidies and programs. How about using the revenues for clean energy subsidies and investments? CCL takes no position on the role of regulation, whether expand, modify, or reduce. It's important to note the likely equity impact if revenues are used for clean energy subsidies and programs instead of a household dividend. The benefits of clean energy programs have gone disproportionately to higher income households. The bottom 60% received only 10% of clean energy tax credits during 2006 to 2012. The upper 20% received 60% of the credits, and the most regressive tax credits were for electric vehicles, where the upper 20% got 90% of the subsidies. Now let's drop down to the household level. Households will feel the cost pass-through of the fee in different ways in heating and cooling, water heating appliances, lighting, electronics. But households have many options to conserve and substitute to control costs. Household energy costs will rise approximately 5 to 10% with the initial $15 per ton fee. This will stimulate awareness and initiation of changed behavior without economic shock and political backlash. The impact on emissions is significant. Fee impact on emissions. The impact on emissions is significant and varies based on assumptions on tax rate trajectory and economic growth. The REMI study, sponsored by CCL, shows over 50% decline in 20 years, as well as health co-benefits, which many models don't address. Other models show potential reductions of 26 to 47% by 2030, exceeding Paris and Clean Power Plan targets. Now let's look at two real-world carbon tax programs. The British Columbia Revenue Neutral Carbon Tax is an outstanding program. However, a key lesson learned is that the tax swap approach to revenue neutrality can break down. The 2008 revenue neutral efficient tax swaps were steered in 2013 to the favored film industry, and revenue neutrality was recently dropped by the center-left party and Green Party following the recent elections. British Columbia has no direct household dividend and constituency to argue for revenue neutrality. The second case in the United Kingdom provides an excellent example of the impact of a carbon tax on behavior and emissions. They imposed a carbon tax, which they called a carbon price floor, on coal and gas for power generation, which caused a 90% decline in coal use over 3 years, from 2014 to 2017. Remarkable. Renewables and gas use increased. The UK imposed it on top of the European Union cap and trade program, which was at only $5 to $9 a ton from 2012 to 2017. Basically, a $25 to $35 a ton carbon tax has eliminated coal power generation in the United Kingdom. Now, the third leg, the border carbon adjustment. I think this is essentially a must-have feature to succeed on a global basis. The border carbon adjustment is critical for avoiding adverse economic impacts due to unfair trade that could result from a carbon fee without border adjustment. It removes any incentive for U.S. industries to move to countries without a comparable carbon price, which would effectively export our pollution. The border carbon adjustment will incentivize other countries to act on carbon pricing. Countries have the incentive to avoid imposing their own carbon price and let others carry the burden. They are free riders in the economic parlance. Experience and research in trade show that idealistic ambition will not be sufficient to get countries to adopt significant country climate programs. For those of you that are going to Washington for the annual conference and lobbying, economic and industry impacts are high on the list of congressional questions and concerns. What about China is a common inquiry in congressional meetings. What is the border carbon adjustment? It's basically a tariff placed on goods imported from or exported to countries without an equivalent price on carbon. It's based on the carbon content of the goods in question. The adjustment has two parts: a tariff on goods imported from countries without an equivalent price on carbon, and a rebate on U.S. exports sent to countries without an equivalent price on carbon. Now, as a point of reference, tariffs between major trading partners are relatively low, commonly 2% or so, with some exceptions. Half the trade between the U.S. and Europe, for example, has no tariff. Which industries are likely to be at risk? There are two characteristics that are pretty common sense. One's using a lot of energy, and those industries that are also facing international competition. There's a term for industries that use a lot of fossil energy. A lot is defined as 5% or more of production costs and are exposed to trade competition. That is, about 15% of the product is imported or exported. Here's the acronym, EITE, Energy Intensive Trade Exposed. Generally, there's not much industry harm at low carbon prices at $10 to $15 a ton. An example of real-world impact of a rising carbon tax and no border adjustment is the case of British Columbia greenhouses, and by greenhouses I mean flowers and vegetables. They suffered competitively at $24 a ton in 2012 and were exempted from the carbon tax in British Columbia. California and Mexican greenhouses undercut them because they had no similar carbon price. Now, keep in mind, this impact was within a province that had no border adjustment. Less than 10% of industries fall into this energy-intensive trade-exposed category. Most industries' energy costs average only about 2% of production costs. So a $25 a ton carbon tax would increase production cost in electric utilities quite a bit, about 20%. For cement and petrochemicals, it'd be around 10%, and aluminum, iron, and steel, and lime, and gypsum, and fertilizer, paper, it'd be about 5%. Why make this adjustment? Because simply a carbon fee adds cost to U.S. firms. The consequence, U.S. firms lose market in both the U.S. and abroad and may move overseas, thereby exporting emissions, which is known as leakage in economic terms. Note that this is also a risk for subnational carbon tax programs, such as in U.S. states or regions. How would the carbon tariff be applied? Hopefully, simplicity and transparency will be the dominant features of a system that assesses carbon content of the products. CCL is not considering applying a border adjustment to all products, only to those deemed energy-intensive, trade-exposed. This allows the use of specific carbon intensity reference values for each covered product, steel, aluminum, glass, etc., as well as allowing the importer to petition for a different value that if they can document a lower footprint. Existing institutions administer the process: the Department of Commerce, International Trade Administration, and U.S. Customs and Border Protection. The funds are collected, they're separate from the carbon fee on CO2, and would build up over time as we import more than we export. A frequent question concerns the legality of the border carbon adjustment. There's a U.S. legal precedent in the 1990 Montreal Protocol involving 197 countries to reduce ozone depleting substances. There are two GATT articles that must be met. The most favored nation, Article 2, and national treatment, as it's called, is Article 3. These two articles only create a problem if the following occurs: if there's discrimination against an import versus a U.S. producer, or if there's discrimination against one country but not another. The CCL border carbon adjustment levels the playing field with no discriminatory impact. In any case, the General Agreement on Tariff and Trade contains Article 20, which allows discriminatory practice for environmental reasons to protect human, animal, or plant life or health, and anything relating to conservation of exhaustible natural resources. That's either way we can see how language within the World Trade Organization GATT provisions protects the legality of a policy, such as a fee and dividend. Now, just how will this border carbon adjustment encourage other countries to adopt a comparable carbon fee? The countries and their firms are incentivized to establish their own carbon price, as they'll be able to keep the U.S. carbon tariff they've been paying to get their product in the U.S. Now, stepping even further back, why global carbon pricing? Climate change is global. It requires a solution that first addresses the free rider problem, second, incentivizes all countries to participate, And third, is a good fit for developing countries with weak institutions, corruption, and income inequality. That's where more than half of the emissions are occurring and growing most rapidly. A carbon fee harmonized across countries over time meets these requirements. Again, subnational initiatives by cities and regions are important, but only a national approach can impose border carbon adjustments. There are various paths to global cooperation that can create the movement toward a global carbon price. Bilateral and multilateral agreements among a subset of nations with a border carbon adjustment and open to others may be the most pragmatic and promising. For example, the US, Canada, Europe, and China could get together. These are some summary points, not exhaustive. With regard to the fee, it works. Fuel prices go up, demand and emissions down. Steady rising prices affect all sectors and stimulate innovation. And the economic impact will be essentially neutral. No catastrophic economic impact in the future. With regard to revenue use, the dividend is most equitable. It builds constituency support for the fee and dividend. And tax swaps and clean energy uses are regressive. With regard to the border carbon adjustment, it addresses unfair foreign competition. Free rider countries are incentivized to adopt the fee, and it incentivizes global carbon pricing, harmonization, and cooperation. So that is, in summary, the fee, dividend, and border carbon adjustment.
With that, if anyone has questions, you know how to contact both Robert and I. We're so grateful for all your support. And at this point, again, a huge round of applause for Robert. Thank you so much for your time and the many hours of preparation you put into distilling this wonderful presentation.
Thank you. We're all on the right track.
We are, and there's strength in numbers. Take care, everyone.